Okay, so before we get started with chapter 1, just a quick note. In Skyward, all grades for this current 6 weeks were finalized yesterday. So Monday had that date of have your work turned in. Based on that, I was able to go back through and drop daily grades and set everybody up. So the actual average that you see is finalized and set. That'll move into the last 6 weeks. My suggestion would be not just to look at what your 6 weeks average is, but to also take a look at what your semester average is looking like. We will have a semester exam this semester. And so that'll count for a seventh of your grade. So just to keep some of those things in mind, hey, how much better, if you're failing, how much better do you need to do this 6 weeks to make sure that you can pass? How well do you need to do on the semester exam? But also for some of you could look at, hey, is my grade where it needs to be for a exemption? Attendance does not count for semester exam exemptions. So they're just going to go based on grades. So seemingly, if your semester average is, I would guess, at least an 85 or above, that would tell me you don't need to take a semester exam. So just kind of keep those things in mind. We're going to start with page 1, chapter 1, here with Gatsby. As we begin the book, we're going to hear this first section where the narrator is going to tell you about a piece of advice he received from his father. Notice that this is the first thing that the book opens with. And so kind of think about why. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way. And I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. All right, let's stop there. How many of you are already swimming? Because you're just like, what? I don't understand anything that we just read. Let's take this step back. First, he tells you that he's going to talk about a piece of advice from his father. Who tells you this?
The narrator.
What's his name? We know that, but does he identify himself? Notice that before he even identifies himself to the reader, he's willing to tell you this piece of advice, seemingly because it's more important than anything else. So we know that the narrator is Nick Carraway based on the work that we've done the last few days. Nick is writing about the summer of 1922. And he's going to introduce that idea today, that the book covers this one single summer, but he's not writing this book in 1922. He's probably writing the book sometime around 1924 or 1925. So think about when you retell a story from your past. Are the details always 100% accurate? No. If you think back to the video we watched about Fitzgerald and his biography, they talk about his friendship with Ernest Hemingway, the writer. And they give you that story of a time that Hemingway changed an incident at a restaurant with a joke so that he got the better line. Think about how many times when you retell a story, you change what you said or how you acted in the retelling to what you wish you did, what you wish that you had said, or to something that you thought was a better way of approaching it. We have to understand that with this book, since Nick is retelling these events, we're going to always question how legitimate this story is. Are you actually telling us exactly how it happened? Or are you embellishing a bit? Notice that he decides to frame this story. Before he starts the story, before he tells us anything about himself, he opens with a piece of advice. Reread that quote from his father. That's the second paragraph there. Reread it to yourself silently, and then see if you can reword it to me. What's this piece of advice?
Sounds like basically don't judge a book by its cover.
Exactly. If someone is telling you this piece of advice that Nick's dad is giving here, remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. If we had to guess, does that put Nick at a place where he is better off or worse off? Like better off than the people that are around him. So notice, just in the way that this advice is framed, we can make some judgments about Nick, about where he comes from, and we're going to have those confirmed today as we read. Now, where most people get lost is in this big paragraph that follows, because all of a sudden, he's just talking about how this advice has been applied. The majority of it doesn't matter. He's giving examples of how things happen. Okay, great. He's telling us that essentially, if you look at the paragraph towards the middle, he makes this point about being open to the secrets of others. And he says that the abnormal mind is quick to detect this quality in the advice that he's given from his dad. Well, think for a second. If you're walking down the street and a homeless dude starts shuffling over to you and he's like, "Hey man, can I talk to you?" What are you going to do? Are you going to be like, "Yeah, man, what's up?" Or are you going to be like, "Stay away from me, I'm good"? Well, if you're going, "Hey, stay away from me, I'm good, don't talk to me," you're judging. Whether you want to admit it or not, we sometimes have this bad idea of judgments. Judgments sometimes keep us out of trouble. But Nick is showing us here, hey, if I'm truly following this advice like I've tried, the abnormal mind is quick to figure it out. Think about that person that at some point in your school career, like you spoke to once or you listened to once, and now they keep finding you in the hallways and they want to talk all the time. Or they see you in class and they think that you're their best friend and you're just like, "Oh my God, leave me alone." Nick's talking about the exact same thing. Because he doesn't judge people, it opens him up in this way. Go to the end of the paragraph, though, because he ends up summing up his point. He says that reserving judgments is a matter of what? Bingo. And here we see the real follow through. All the details, okay, great. But if we notice, paragraphs are always chunked in ideas. So if we kind of look towards the beginning and the end of it, a lot of times we can figure out, what am I supposed to pull away? And here he tells you, The reason why I try to reserve judgments is that I'm always hopeful of what's going to happen. Yeah, I'm going to find some crazy people. Yeah, I'm going to hear some secrets I don't want to. But I'm always hopeful of the end. Now go back and process this. Remember that Nick, our narrator, is going to talk about a summer in his past. He's telling us one of the most important pieces of advice I ever received is to not judge people, and that not judging people is a matter of being hopeful. Think about how he's prefacing the story he's going to tell us. Likely the things that happened here in the summer of 1922 happened because Nick tried to not judge the people around him. And the reason he keeps to that is that he's always hopeful. Does that inspire a lot of hope in you about the story that's going to happen? Remember, we're only 3 paragraphs in, and so you could be yes and you could be no. It's okay. We want to have that idea of, hey, how does this hit you before he rounds out this next part? Because you notice here at the bottom of the page, or somewhere on your page, do you have a break in the text after this next paragraph? Are there some dots or a larger space? Or does it simply go from one paragraph to the next? Okay, so most printings of this book have what you see here at the bottom of the page. This is a definite break. You sometimes see this in a book. If it's not a marking, it's a bigger space between the paragraphs to kind of show we're jumping from one big idea to the next. So we're going to finish this next paragraph, and then we're going to reprocess what we got here. He says, and after boasting this way of my tolerance about not judging people, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability, which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It's what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. Okay, so let's go back and tear apart this paragraph in a similar way to what we did previously. He's introduced this concept that this is a piece of advice he finds important. And he tells us that keeping this advice as important is about maintaining hope. What does he start the next paragraph by telling us?
That it was cloudy.
That what?
That it was clouded again.
I maybe clouded isn't the right idea there, and instead focus on this idea about tolerance. What does he say about his tolerance?
He was getting angry at how long he was waiting again.
Well, you notice it's not anger in his response, but that it has a limit. So he says, yeah, I can absolutely not judge people. I can hope, but you know what? There's a limit to how much crap I can put up with. And he's like, this summer of 1922 pushed me to my limit. I saw a lot of people that pushed that idea of not judging them to its full core. And he says, except for one person. Who is it?
Gatsby.
Gatsby. Now, don't get confused because people do. I've had students that legitimately misread the title here and think that because the title is The Great Gatsby, we're talking about a magician. No, he's not going to do magic. But instead, what Fitzgerald is going to do is talk about Gatsby through the early parts of this book, but not show us this guy. But based on how Nick describes him here, is he good or bad? Yeah. But I want to focus you on one line here that often gets overlooked because people go, oh, Gatsby's great. Oh, we have this. But he says, Gatsby represents everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. Okay, so tell me what the word scorn means.
Dislikes.
Yeah. He says, Gatsby's exempt from this. Everybody else pushed my tolerance except for Gatsby. And he says, Gatsby, who represents everything I hate. And you're going, hold up a second. You're saying that you're tired of people that you don't judge people and you're tired of people pushing your judgments, except for this one guy who's like representative of all the things you can't stand. Do you know people that, really you don't agree with a lot of the things they say, but you can't help but like them? I think we got to look at Gatsby in a similar way. Nick is going to show us, hey, there's a lot about him that, but there's also something about him that just draws me in. So notice as a reader, we're kind of hooked here. Okay, you're going to tell me this story? Okay, this guy is so great. All right, I'm in. Now, he skips here. We talked about this break in the text. You're going to notice that as he comes back here in the next paragraph, we're going to get the background of Nick, who he is, how he's described. So think about some of the details that are going to stand out here in telling us a little bit about this guy who we haven't even named yet and who they're still not going to totally name yet. Nick says, my family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 1851, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter of a century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed tectonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me and finally said, why, yes, with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east. Permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. All right, so let's fill in some details about what we know about Nick. So here we get our characterizing bits. Tell me what details stand out to you about Nick.
Probably mid-20s.
Yeah, he's somewhere in his, I'm going to tell you, late, because he graduated from Yale University in 1915. And so most people think when they graduate from college, they're about 22. The book takes place in 1922. So you kind of add that together. He's about 29, 30, right in that area. Okay. Yale University. It's an Ivy League school. It's a big deal. Tell me about Nick's family. Do they have money or not?
Yeah.
They have money. Notice some details that stand out. How did they make their money? Hardware stores. Also notice that Nick says that his father agrees to finance him for a year. That means his father is saying, hey, if you want to go to New York, I'll help pay your bills for a whole year. Dang. And notice, he's not a kid. This guy's 29 years old, and his father's like, yeah, I'll pay your bills for a year. Whew. They got some money. Notice how he tries to talk about his family heritage, how great they are. He ties it back to being a duke in Scotland, but they're not. They're just normal people. Any other details that stand out to you about Nick?
Takes pride in his family.
Yeah, there's a pride in his family. There's a pride in himself. Talk to me about the delayed tectonic migration. What's the Great War?
World War I.
Okay, so let's talk about this for a second because this came up in a bunch of your pre-reading stuff. World War I, you've covered World War I in history. Okay, good. So we don't have to hit a lot of this. Talk to me about the casualty rates for soldiers in World War I. High or low? High. In some companies, as high as 20%. So if we're looking here, we have about 10 people in this room. So do your quick math. What's 20% of 10? 2. So guess what? You're dead, you're dead. You're not coming back anymore. So when we're looking at that, that's huge. Think about the fact that World War I is also the first major American war that doesn't take place on American soil. So imagine that you're Nick, right? He tells you that he grew up somewhere in the Midwest. Okay, so imagine Kansas. Just go with me. Nick isn't from Kansas, but just imagine for a second. You're from Kansas. How many times do you think you've ever been out of your hometown in your life? Probably pretty rare, right? But you get shipped over to Europe. You get to see this old world. You get to experience food you've never seen, languages you've never heard. But you also see all these horrors. Was there anything on the line for America in World War I? Nothing. And so imagine you're Nick, you come back, and you come back to that little town in Kansas, and nothing has changed. It is exactly the same. But some of your friends didn't come back. But you've been exposed to this larger world and you realize how really small and insignificant everything here is. This is what kind of pushes that whole lost generation concept. It's not that these people didn't know what to do as much as they realized the larger bit of the world and they saw that coming back and living a life in a small town, they didn't know how to do that. Notice that Nick says something about his return from the war. How does he describe himself? He says he comes back. Everybody see that word? I want you to look for this word as we read in this book. Fitzgerald, time and time again, will return to this description for characters, whether it's their features being restless, their actions, their words. These characters are part of that generation, just like Fitzgerald is. They don't know how to fit in, and they don't see what to do, and so they're kind of just uncertain. So Nick takes off for New York in the summer of 1922. Okay, he's going to talk about where he's going to find a place. He's going to talk about some things here. He says the practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season. And I just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month. But at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog. Well, at least I had him for a few days until he ran away. And an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning some man more recently arrived than I stopped me on the road. How do you get to West Egg Village? He asked helplessly. I told him. And as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had the familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. Okay, do me a favor. Open a new tab on your computer and Google a map of New York City. We're going to use this as a reference, and I want you to have the picture in front of you so that you can see what we're talking about. So it doesn't matter what you got. It doesn't have to be super special because it's going to work. New York has what's called 5 boroughs. Everybody familiar with that concept? Heard that term? Okay, so the main borough is the island of Manhattan. It is the slender, small island tucked away. Most of what you probably assume and picture when I talk about New York City is Manhattan. It's where Wall Street is. It's where Broadway is. It's where Times Square is. The Statue of Liberty is off of Manhattan. But there are those other boroughs around. Nick says the sensible thing would be to find an apartment in Manhattan. That's the city. But instead, where they're going to find a house is out on Long Island. So you notice Manhattan's very small, and Long Island is this big island that goes east to west, out to the ocean. That's where we're going to head in a second as he's talking. Nick describes the house that he finds as a cardboard bungalow. Is he living in a cardboard house? No, but it's a cheap little house. Just kind of go with that. He's going to talk about why it seems so cheap in a moment as well. And so he's going to talk about what life is like here for him. He says there was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is so much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. He says it was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, 2 unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of saltwater in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They're not perfect ovals. Like the egg in the Columbus story, they're both crushed flat at the contact end. But their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. So if you look at that map of Long Island, you notice that as you look at Long Island Sound there, like Nick says, there are these little juts out of Long Island that happen. He is describing 2 parts of it in the real thing. I think one of them is Manhasset Bay. Don't get too specific about, hey, I got to find them on the map. Just think about there are 2 spots that jut out from Long Island with water between them. They look the same, but he's going to describe what's different about them here in a moment. He says, I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the 2. though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house is at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Okay, so let's talk about where Nick lives. There are these two spots that jut out. He lives on which one? West Egg. So if you're thinking east-west, this is the one that would be closer to the continent. West Egg. How does he describe West Egg?
Less fashion.
Yeah. Let's talk about that. He lives at a place that he rents this little house for $80 a month. And how much do the mansions around him rent for? Yeah, 12 to 15,000 for the season. So think for like 3 months. So comparatively, he's paying 80 and the person next to him is paying $3,000 to $4,000 a month to be there. Dang. And that's back in 1922. You looked at inflation, you're looking at a couple of $100,000 to rent this place. Does that seem like it's not fashionable to you? If you're spending all that money? Probably like, what's not fashionable about that? Well, let me give you a little comparison. I want you to think about the difference between Colleyville and Southlake for a second. Are the houses any less nice if you live in Colleyville? But do those Southlake people with their purse hanging off of their elbow and the little dog in it, are they gonna look at it differently? Oh, they're gonna be like, oh, you live in Colleyville? Oh, you don't live in Southlake. Sorry. I want you to think of the difference between East Egg and West Egg is exactly like that. It's not that West Egg isn't nice, it's that it's just not East Egg. Now, Nick is going to be going to East Egg, and we're going to hear who he's going to meet and some information about them. He says, across that bay, the courtesy bay between the two, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water. And the history of the summer of 1922 really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Okay, so let's look at this. Each chapter of the book roughly focuses on one event. This first chapter is going to focus on this dinner with Tom and Daisy. Who are Tom and Daisy to Nick? Yes. So Daisy, his cousin. Don't get lost in, oh, well, it's his second. Who cares? His cousin. Tom, college buddy. So we know he knows both. It's not as though, hey, I'm going to have dinner with my cousin and I don't really know her husband. He knows both. He's going to talk about Tom here. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way. One of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They'd spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever seeking, little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. All right, so what do we need to know about Tom? What was he known for in college? He was known as a great football player. And they tell you that he peaked at 21. Tom is the guy that comes back to our high school football games, still wearing his Letterman and talking about how 1996 Haltom football was the best ever. Aaron, I know you probably know that guy from playing football. You could probably think of that guy that shows up to the game and wants to talk to all of you guys like, man, you guys don't even know. For Tom, college football was the best ever, and he's always trying to get back to that. If you've ever seen Napoleon Dynamite, just think about Uncle Rico, and you got it. Tom is going to be described as strong and powerful, but his most important feature is that he is rich. Nick says it's hard to imagine someone his age that is just as rich. Think about, Reggie, when you see players that come out of high school and go in the NFL or the NBA straight up, can you always reconcile that in your mind to think they're not that much older than me? You can. You can understand that it's like, wow, that kid's just as old as, almost as old as I am, and look at how much money they're making and look at how great they are. Sometimes, but you know that sometimes you look at it like, how does that, he's not that much older than me. Why are they giving him all this money? We have that problem. And so Nick says the same thing. It's hard to recognize that Tom has all this money. And so we're going to describe his house here. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected. A cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the sides in bright vines as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. Okay, so we're going to put a pin in it here for today. You notice we've hit all four questions. Nick's background. Who are Tom and Daisy? How is Tom described? We got those. So we want to make sure we have it filled out and turned in for today. You will